Hello and welcome to New NATO. I'm David Lipson. The global implications of Russia's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine will likely see Finland and Sweden join NATO, the Western military alliance. It signifies an historic shift in policy for the peace-loving Nordic countries and significantly redraws Europe's security map. The North Atlantic Treaty Organisation was formed in 1949 by 12 countries, including the US, UK, Canada and France. NATO's original aim was to counter Russian expansion in Europe after World War II. Members agree to come to one another's aid if they come under armed attack. NATO has now sent elements of its 40,000-strong response force to countries bordering Russia and Ukraine. It has fighter jets on alert and naval ships, including aircraft carrier groups, patrolling the seas. Both Sweden and Finland, which has a 1,340-kilometre border with Russia, have highly capable militaries. NATO members agree to spend 2% of their GDP on defence. Finland's expected to meet that target this year, and Sweden says it'll do so as soon as possible. Well, Minna Alonda is a Northern Europe expert at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs in Berlin, and she joins me now. Thanks so much for being with us. Just paint a picture for us, the historical and geopolitical significance of these two countries that have prided themselves on their neutrality in the past, racing to join NATO.
So basically, if you look at the operational side, the difference whether they will now get full membership or stay outside is not huge, because both Finland and Sweden have been already cooperating very closely with NATO for a long time. They already enhanced opportunity partners, and the interoperability of both Finnish and Swedish armed forces with NATO structures is very high. And that has been also a deliberate policy in both Finland and Sweden in the past decades to reach this kind of highest possible level of interoperability and closest possible cooperation just below the threshold of full membership. I would say that actually maybe in Finland, non-alignment, you can't really speak of neutrality in the stricter sense of the term, because both countries have been EU members since 1995. So in that sense, they have not been neutral in the European security architecture, but just non-aligned militarily. And in Finland, this has been the non-alignment was a pragmatic decision, and now deciding to join NATO is as well a pragmatic decision. So maybe less a matter of pride. For Sweden, it's a bit different, because as the Swedish foreign policy identity has been very strongly centered around this narrative of neutrality and non-alignment.
When you talk about there not being such a huge difference should they join, formally, surely that security guarantee, though, that if another country touches one of them, invades one of them, it affects all of NATO. They come to their aid. Surely that's a big difference.
That is a huge difference indeed, yes. That is the biggest difference, absolutely. There is also a kind of regional dimension to this, the Nordic Defence Cooperation, acronym NORDEFCO. So in that sense, of course, these two countries now finally being full members of the club, that enables new levels of cooperation, natural, it will be enhanced and deepened and intensified, and it makes a big difference, especially for the Article 5. Not only will other NATO members come to their help, but of course Finland and Sweden will also come to other NATO members' help. What I meant was maybe that because of this very close cooperation already in the past decades, and which has been intensified a lot, especially since 2014, the Crimea annexation by Russia, there is not a huge operational, in the day-to-day basis. So these two countries will be able to contribute almost instantly.
I see. So obviously this move, should it go ahead, will not only offer those guarantees for Finland and Sweden, but also expand the footprint of NATO. But what are the risks? I mean, Russia has already launched 3 wars on the basis of an expanded NATO, or fears of an expanded NATO. Could this provoke Russia further?
Basically, this is a move of risk reduction for Finland and Sweden. The idea here is to kind of make the threshold of any military aggression towards these two countries as high as possible. This is the idea. It's kind of like an extra insurance. Finland, for example, has a very capable defense capacity, and the Finnish defense is entirely kind of calibrated towards like defending our eastern border. So the idea is not to outsource our defense now to NATO and to like trust NATO to come to defend our border to Russia once we are members, but it is more like an insurance. Like when you see that your neighbor's house is burning because someone set it on fire, of course you will want to get an insurance for your house in this way. Yeah.
What about Turkey's role in this? For now, they're resisting this move, and that could bring it down. How do you see that ending? Will Turkey, in your view, ultimately allow this?
I'm still confident that Turkey is not intent on like entirely blocking Finland and Sweden from accessing NATO, but he's just putting a price on accepting the new members, and that he's kind of like out to get the best possible deal. I think there's some domestic signaling in this. He wants to show strength domestically with elections coming up next year in Turkey. And this Kurdish issue is always kind of like convenient for Erdogan to use for his domestic purposes. And on the other hand, this is not only about Sweden and Finland, it's also about USA. So I think Erdogan is using this as to strengthen his negotiation position vis-a-vis USA, especially what comes to the exclusion from the F-35 fighter jet program.
Minna Alonda from the German Institute for International and Security Affairs in Berlin. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Well, there are reports amid its war in Ukraine, Russia is conducting nuclear drills on its own soil. It's part of a pattern of nuclear sabre rattling from Moscow since it invaded its western neighbour more than 3 months ago. Experts have warned the war in Ukraine could drive nuclear proliferation and, more broadly, defence budgets and weapons purchases. Weapons of war, of brutality, of mass destruction. At times used as instruments in the balance of power, but at worst, they're the tools of tyrants. Before Russia's war in Ukraine, arms sales the world over were down, with a few exceptions. One of those was weapons sales to Europe, driven by a deterioration in relations with Russia. Another is arms sales to Oceania, and in particular to Australia, fuelled by tensions with China. The constellation of arms sales from 6 countries, China, France, Germany, the UK, Russia and the United States, makes up 80% of the world's weapons exports. The US has the lion's share of the market, followed by Russia. Moscow's top customers are India and China, 2 world powers notably absent from the host of countries which have placed sanctions on Russia for waging war on Ukraine. India, one of the largest arms importers in the world, relies on Russia for half the weapons it brings in from overseas, whereas China has turned to manufacturing more of its own weapons. Its share of the global arms import market is less than half that of India. And while there are foreign policy objectives in selling to certain countries over others, the weapons business is not primarily geared towards values, rather value, worth more than $500 billion a year. Given where we are today, it might come as a surprise that when Russian-backed separatists took parts of eastern Ukraine in 2015, 10 EU countries continued to export weapons to Moscow in the years that followed, sales which amounted to more than $500 million. But now, with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Europe's geopolitical defence strategy has shifted.
We have been living in an amazing era of peace in the last few decades, and it wasn't some kind of hippie fantasy. You saw it in the bottom line, you saw it in the budgets. In Europe, in the European Union, the average defense budget of EU members was around 3% of government budget. And that's a historical miracle, almost. For most of history, the budget of kings and emperors and sultans, like 50%, 80% goes to war, goes to the army.
Germany, France, Belgium, Italy, Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, Norway and even Sweden have all announced increases to their defence budgets in the face of a rising Russian threat to the EU and NATO.
Given what they are facing, it's reasonable for the Germans, for the Poles, for all of Europe to double their budgets. And you see other countries around the world doing the same thing. But this is a race to the bottom. When they double their budgets, other countries look and feel insecure and double their budgets. So they have to double them again and triple them. And the money that should go to healthcare, that should go to education, that should go to fight climate change, this money will now go to tanks, to missiles, to fighting wars. Even if you live in Australia, even if you live in Brazil, you will feel the repercussions of this war in less healthcare, in a deteriorating ecological crisis.
In addition to raising its defence budget by 14%, Romania has started emergency iodide pill production, which helps block radiation poisoning in the event of a nuclear blast. There are concerns over Russian President Vladimir Putin's decision to put his nuclear deterrence forces on high alert.
Just before the invasion, as Russian ground forces massed on the Ukraine border, Putin observed an exercise of Russian strategic nuclear forces. Days later, in his televised announcement of the invasion, he ominously warned the United States and its NATO partners, quote, "To anyone who would consider interfering from the outside, if you do, you will face consequences greater than any you have faced in history." Close quote. Putin's nuclear saber-rattling highlights the danger of introducing nuclear weapons into a conventional conflict. His move could begin a cycle of escalation that would be very difficult to control.
More than 90% of the world's nuclear weapons are divided between the US and Russia, with the remainder spread out among 7 other nuclear-armed countries. Russia's war in Ukraine has a number of potential disastrous consequences, one of which is the potential for a new era of nuclear proliferation, including rogue states.
I've long suspected that Russia has been quietly supporting North Korean missile developments for a number of years. I think that those suspicions were confirmed recently because among the sanctions against Russia were some sanctions, some Russian companies for supporting North Korea's missile programs. So I think you could see Russia increasing its support of, increasing its aid to North Korea in terms of weapons development.
Since the beginning of the Cold War, nuclear weapons have been part of the calculus of the global balance of power. But with Russia's destabilising war, a new paradigm may be emerging in which we're forced to consider the worst. Or, in the words of Albert Einstein, "I know not which weapons World War III will be fought, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones." Well, let's take a look now at the perspective from inside Russia's borders. Pavel Felgenhauer is a Russian military analyst and he joins me now from Moscow. Thanks very much for being with us. First of all, what is the state of play in Ukraine and throughout Europe as far as Moscow sees it now?
Well, Russia is continuing its operation, as it's called, hoping to achieve victory in the coming summer campaign. The land is already dry enough to fight move heavy vehicles. And both sides, of course, are preparing for a decisive summer campaign, which begins more or less in earnest right now and will last maybe till October. If there won't be, of course, a ceasefire somewhere along the road, which right now seems rather impossible. Both sides have broken off any kind of negotiations. Their positions on the how to end this conflict are miles apart. That means both sides believe that on the battlefield they can achieve more than at the negotiations. So it's going to be more war and war and not talk and talk in the coming months.
Yeah, because what does victory look like for Russia now?
Well, Russia has already said that the Ukraine should recognize the annexation of Crimea as Russian, recognize the independence of these smallish Donbas states that Russia has recognized. Now again, Russia also says that Ukraine and other provinces that Russia right now controls, they can also maybe become independent. And of course, most likely Ukraine would have to take commitments not to join NATO, not to disarm or something like that. So Russia has a lot of what they want from Ukraine. Ukraine is not ready to give and demands that Russia return to positions antebellum as they were on February the 24th, which Russia is not ready to do after all the sacrifice and losses. So that's how it is. But Russia is so much engaged in Ukraine means that, say, the Russian reaction to Sweden and Finland joining NATO is going to be very muted. Because Russia can not do much about it, too preoccupied with Ukraine and, of course, the sanctions that are increasingly going to bite into the Russian economy and financial system and overall infrastructure of the country.
How real do you think are these thinly veiled threats by Moscow of nuclear attacks? This sort of sabre rattling on that, especially as we see this arms race now accelerating across Europe?
Well, the arms race accelerating in Europe and maybe in other countries is about conventional weapons, because the Ukrainian conflict is all about conventional weapons. And actually, the usage of armaments and munitions is so high that stockpiles in Russia and in Europe and in other countries are getting increasingly low, because production can't really right now cover the losses. So that means there's going to be a large expansion of the defense industry worldwide to just cover the losses, replace the stockpiles that are being right now rapidly used up. Nuclear weapons are weapons of deterrence, and that's how Russia is using them right now, to deter as much as it can Western intervention, support for Ukraine. Well, it's effective in that respect that the United States and its allies said that they will not get involved in no way in this conflict, directly. The United States sent some additional troops to Europe, but not very much. American tank and motorized divisions are not really arriving from the United States, where they have been stationed since the end of the Cold War. And American Air Force is also not coming in full strength to Europe. So that means the deterrence is working, but the West is also supplying weapons, and their deterrence is not working very well. But nuclear weapons are not really for use, they're for deterrence. And right now the use, you have to threaten your opponent for him to kind of modify his position, for him to think that you're crazy enough to use the nuclear option. But right now it doesn't seem possible in the immediate situation. I don't think that there's a threat of nuclear war just breaking out right now. But of course, things could change. There could be an escalation that could bring us to the nuclear threshold.
You mentioned sanctions earlier. I'm interested in your view on how sanctions are impacting on the Russian war machine, its actual ability to fight this war.
It's not on the war machine itself, but on defense industry, of course, they do, because Russian defense industry, unlike the Soviet Union, used a lot of Western components, Western materials, plastic, steel, and electronics to build or modernize its weapons, and now that's been cut off. Of course, their supplies, their stockpiles, still there, so that means some kind of work is going on. The real effect of sanctions will begin to impact Russia and Russian industry and Russian basic networking of the country, like communications and transport and logistics, somewhere in the fall. When the Russian stockpiles are dried up, Russia hopes to find other sources out of in third world, in China, to replace Western, what she was getting from the West, essential imports. Will that be actually happening or not is not clear, but the sanctions, everyone knows, they begin to really seriously bite also on Russian defense industry somewhere later on. Will it be able to replace the losses? But that's right now not clear.
Pavel Felgenhauer joining us from Moscow. Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you.
As the war rages on, Russia has lashed out at Finland's official bid to join the NATO alliance. The historically neutral nation faced a swift and hostile response to its plans. From the capital Helsinki, Europe correspondent Isabella Higgins reports.
Helsinki has seen conflict come from the east and the west, once controlled by Sweden and later ruled by the Russian Empire. The city square is a constant reminder of life under a Russian Tsar. But the conflict in Ukraine has incited fresh fear about their eastern neighbour.
Finland was attacked by the Soviet Union, and Finland had to fight through the Winter War on its own without any allies. We lost 10% of our national territory.
"89-year-old Harry Blasar remembers when this area was struck during war times.
I was playing around on the street when it started, so that was the first wave of bombing. I thought it was a very sad thing.
Here, some of the thousands of men who died in World War II have been laid to rest. Some Finns say it's a reminder of the challenge of fighting a war alone.
To make sure that that will never ever happen to Finland again, the Finnish public support for NATO has increased tremendously.
Moscow could pose a very real threat to this country. On the other side of this lake is a tiny portion of their shared 1,300-kilometre land border. We're closer here to St. Petersburg than we are to Helsinki. Vladimir Putin warned if it sees Finland expanding its military in this zone, there will be consequences. A large portion of this Karelia region was ceded to the Soviets, and this border country still bears the scars of battle.
If the tank managed to cross the stone line and the mines, and then it would come here and burn the tank with a Molotov cocktail.
Tapio Koskinen's dad guarded these forts. The family were forced to move here after their home was taken over by the Soviets. He feels for the people of Ukraine.
I think I understand, because it's very similar than our situation in 1939.
We're escorted by one of the few Finns allowed to reveal these wartime bunkers.
So mind your head, doors are very low.
These outposts stretch for hundreds of kilometres along the Finnish border. Almost every one of them is engraved with this emblem.
And the meaning, you see, there's a hand with a straight sword and the hand with the curved sword. That's the eternal fight between the West and the East.
Finland's future may be with the West, but it's a choice firmly grounded in history. Isabella Higgins, ABC News, Helsinki.
Well, Stephen Loosely is from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute and he joins me now. Thank you for being with us. You believe that Russia lost this war from the moment it invaded. Just explain your thinking on that.
Well, you look at the cascade of events. For a start, Russia has lost Ukraine forever in terms of the Ukrainian people. The evidence is overwhelming that even Ukrainians who are of Russian background, Russian speakers, have aligned themselves with Kyiv and with the fight against the invaders. Then you have the circumstances of Germany. Russia had always believed, particularly with the centre-left government, they would have harmonious relations with the Germans given the significance of exports of oil and gas. At one stroke, Chancellor Scholz told the Bundestag that Germany was living in a new reality, doubled the defence budget and began exporting weapons to assist Ukraine, really in defiance of their own law.
Yeah, and of all the sort of increases in defence spending that we've seen all over Europe, I mean, that one in Germany, that pivot, was probably the most stark, wasn't it?
Oh, it is. And it's going to prove to be the most important shift in terms of NATO in Europe. And this is a government of the centre-left. As with the Swedes, a social democratic prime minister, the Swedes have given away 200 years at least of neutrality, now wishing to come in under the NATO umbrella. Now, both Sweden and Finland have been effective partners since 1994, but you have a circumstance in which Finnish membership of NATO, as mentioned in the earlier commentary, brings a 1,300-kilometre border with Russia into focus. With Sweden, they're now militarising the island of Gotland in the middle of the Baltic, past which Russian naval units must pass. Now, you have a circumstance in which NATO has been mobilised very effectively by the Biden administration and actually stretches beyond NATO in terms of the response to the Russian invasion. David, just a while ago, General Austin, the Defence Secretary, US Defence Secretary, convened a meeting in Ramstein, Germany. There are over 40 countries in the contact group. So the response to the Russian invasion has been absolutely enormous. It has shifted opinion massively. Look at Finland, for example. From memory, there are 200 Finnish MPs in Helsinki. 188 voted to join NATO. Where if you look at 2 years ago, there was well short of a majority in Finnish opinion of joining NATO. All this has been brought about by the invasion of Ukraine, the sanctions against Russia that are in play. Some will bite later in the year, there's no question about that, particularly with the banking system. But you have a circumstance in which we are close to living in a bifurcated world, with the dictatorial powers in one corner and the Western democracies and others aligned with the Western democracies in another. It's been an absolutely seismic shift.
The US, Stephen, is still really the linchpin of NATO, you'd have to say. Is there any risk for the US, do you think, with its expansion or potential expansion, that it would have to provide cover or assistance to a greater number of countries in Europe, especially when its real focus is Asia and China?
Well, what has actually happened, and you're absolutely right, the United States is the linchpin of NATO, always has been since it was founded during the time of the Truman administration. But what's actually happened in Europe, with Europe rising to the occasion, refitting their armed forces and adopting a far more determined defensive posture, the United States can actually focus better on Asia, on the Indo-Pacific. And that's happening, and that's been made clear. That's why Secretary Blinken came out to Australia, the US Secretary of State, while the Ukraine crisis was brewing and then exploding. The signal from the US was the focus is on the Indo-Pacific. Europe remains important, as does the Middle East, but the Europeans can now do more to assist themselves. And in terms of what's happening with the support of Ukraine, with the intelligence gathering that's going on, particularly by the British as well as the US, it has been an extraordinarily effective response by the West to this aggression. Now, ask ourselves, the Baltic states, NATO members, far less likely to be the subject of a Russian invasion than, say, Moldova or Georgia, not NATO members. And part of Putin's strategy appears to be to drive across Ukraine to link up with Transnistria on the border of Moldova. Whether or not he can accomplish that remains to be seen.
Stephen
There's a lot more
Loosely from
fierce fighting to go.
Indeed, indeed. Thank you so much for your insights, Stephen Loosely. Great to have you with us.
Pleasure, David.
The International Criminal Court has described Ukraine as a crime scene and said it was carrying out its largest ever investigation there, with plans to open an office in the capital, Kyiv. Since the war began nearly 100 days ago, hundreds of civilians and soldiers have been captured by Russian forces. Some of them have shared harrowing stories of survival.
Metal scaffolding, holding together Khlib's broken pelvis. He also broke his jaw and lost vision in one eye. Khlib is only just taking his first steps. 2 months ago, he was defending Mariupol with the Marines, watching for the enemy.
I turned my head and saw a tank aimed at me. I saw a bright flash. I felt the building collapsing.
He survived, but was captured. No one knew whether he was dead or alive until this video was posted online by his captors. He was taken to a hospital in Russian-occupied territory.
They held a dagger on my leg, up my throat, then led to my ear and said, "It would be nice to cut off your ear." They did it to nearly everyone. I couldn't feed myself because my jaw was broken and I couldn't sit up. But some nurses would taunt me by leaving food down in front of me and say, "Try and eat that, you low-life Ukrainian."
This is Khlib's testimony. We haven't been able to independently verify his claims.
We were lying there without any painkillers or anything. So only my faith and the understanding that I had to survive helped me to carry on.
After 17 days, Khlib was released in a prisoner exchange. This war has seen the Russians take people, citizens, as they try to do two things. Use them as currency in prisoner exchanges, and that's worked in some cases, but they've also tried to crush resistance. For 46 days of captivity, Dmytro Vasilyev refused to pledge allegiance to Russia, despite being born in Moscow. He was a government worker in Kherson region when the invaders moved in.
The worst time was at the end. I was in solitary confinement and heard people being beaten upstairs every day, handcuffed to the radiator. My family was so worried.
Dmytro was also freed after Ukraine negotiated his release.
I'm not a military man, but I will do everything I can for my country to win this war and return our territories.
I want to go back and continue fighting for Ukraine, to help bring us victory over Russia.
Well, let's take a look at where the fighting is happening right now in Ukraine. Currently, Russian forces are focused on capturing the cities of Severodonetsk and Lysychansk in the eastern Donbass region. Russian separatists hold significant territory in the Donbass prior to the invasion, and Moscow says its forces are fighting for its, quote, liberation. This represents a shift from Russia's earlier ambitions. Looking back, after bitter fighting on the capital's outskirts, Russian forces finally pulled away from Kyiv in early April, retreating into Belarus and the mother country. A month later, and after weeks of heavy shelling, Russia then withdrew from Ukraine's second largest city, Kharkiv. As Russian forces continued their withdrawal from the north and west, the bombardment of Mariupol intensified. The port city is, of course, key to Russia's control of the southeast coast and the annexed region of Crimea. Mariupol was besieged from day one of the war and finally fell 83 bloody days later with the surrender of soldiers at the Azovstal steelworks. Which brings us to where we are today. Russian forces fiercely seeking to dominate the eastern Donbass region. Russia's foreign minister saying taking control of it is an unconditional priority. Well, on the ground, fighting is raging in Severodonetsk as Russian troops advance towards the centre of the city, which is the last in the Luhansk region to remain outside Russian control. A new Russian commander, General Alexander Dvornikov, is overseeing a refocused invasion, but is he repeating the same mistakes in the campaign in eastern Ukraine that forced Russia to abandon its push to take the entire country? Well, former Australian Army General Mick Ryan joins me now. Mick Ryan, thank you as always for being with us. Just paint for us the picture of yet another shift in this war. Is it working better for Russia than it's gone for it before?
Well, the Russians have learned some things from their time in Ukraine so far. They've certainly learned that they need to narrow down their strategic objectives, and they've also learned that they need to concentrate their forces and not commit them penny-packeted as they were in the north and in the northeast in the early stages of the war. And as we're seeing from their advances over the last couple of weeks, these are starting to work for them. The thing we don't know is how long they can keep up this current offensive.
So there has been a significant adaptation by Russia. It seems it's learning from its mistakes.
I think they are. I mean, they are still having issues with leadership. They've lost a lot of their mid-level leaders in this invasion so far. They're still having some issues with the coordination of air-ground cooperation, but they are learning on the ground, and in particular, they're bringing to bear a particular strength of the Russian army, which is their artillery. They are moving slowly to not expose their logistics like they did in the north, and they're advancing behind heavy barrages of artillery, notwithstanding the fact that this is enormously destructive to civilian infrastructure and kills many, many innocent civilians.
Yeah, on artillery, I mean, we've seen Ukraine also adapting pretty successfully to the use of weapons sent in from the West. Now the US has agreed to send in these high-mobility artillery rocket systems. The key, though, from the US is they're saying that these are to be used inside Ukraine. They're not meant to be shooting across the border into Russia.
Well, the HIMARS system is a very powerful system. Not only can it deploy quickly, shoot and then get out of the way, its range, which is about 70 kilometres with the standard rocket system, which the Americans are going to provide, keeps it well out of the range of most Russian artillery systems. And at the same time, it can cover a large part of eastern Ukraine with a 70-kilometre range.
So can you see any sign that the tide is turning, in Russia's favour? That they've been on the back foot really since the start of this war?
Well, one of the things with war is the tide shifts constantly. We see a back and forth of advantage between Ukraine and Russia constantly. We see a back and forth in the geographic location of where this war is centred. It would be fair to say the Russians are advancing in the east, but we don't know how long they can do that for. But in order for them to achieve these advances, they've had to concentrate the vast majority of their combat power there. It's left them vulnerable in other parts of the country. And as we've seen over the weekend, the Ukrainians, who are excellent at targeting Russian weaknesses, have launched some counter-offensives around Kherson.
So what about the end game? Can you see, and I've asked you this before, any sign of an off-ramp at this point, or are we strapping in for a very long campaign?
Well, this war will go on as long as both countries have the will to fight it and the physical means to fight it. Both of them have that. The Russians are determined that they will take some kind of success out of this war, and the Ukrainians, as the president said over the weekend, wants to reclaim the territory that's been captured since 24 February. I think we should be steeling ourselves for something that will be quite a long war.
Former Australian Army General Mick Ryan, thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
Well, by invading Ukraine, Vladimir Putin is potentially destroying the lives of people far from the battleground. The war is battering the global food system. The price of wheat is up almost 60% since the start of the conflict. European leaders just announced a €9 billion aid package for Ukraine and moved to tackle the backlog of Ukrainian crops that is threatening a global food crisis. Well, Deepmala Marla is the Vice President of Humanitarian Affairs at Care International and joins us from Bangkok. Thanks for being with us. Let's start with Ukraine, this aid assistance package. How important, how crucial is it for the people of Ukraine, and how on earth will aid agencies get that food to those who need it most on the front lines?
Actually, that is a highly relevant and important topic. So let's say that before the 24th of February, the genesis of the current global hunger crisis dated much before due to series of factors. For example, the climate change and climate shocks have affected the agriculture-related livelihoods, forced people to displace their homes, like as in Horn of Africa or the dry corridor of Central America. The economic fallout of COVID-19, increased unemployment, a heightened poverty, and conflict, as you hinted. Today, as we speak, the biggest driver of global hunger is conflict. So while all these people were already in urgent need, and we are talking of 811 million people globally who are going to sleep hungry tonight, a war happens in the region which used to be the breadbasket for North Africa, Middle East, Europe. Russia and Ukraine combined, they account for almost a third of world's wheat and barley, 3/4 of the world's sunflower oil. So in other words, there was already a very, very imminent life-saving crisis needing a humanitarian response. Now, to your point, how on earth are aid agencies going to take the aid to those who need it most? Absolutely. One of the biggest challenges for us is humanitarian access. We cannot save lives when we have grenades showering all over. The international humanitarian law commits all the member states to not destroy and protect civilians and civilian infrastructure. Let aid agencies reach those who are on need. But right now, we have many detriments. One is the insufficient funding, and we really, really welcome the recent announcement of $9 billion. And the other thing which we need along with is the ability to reach those who are most in need, because millions are on the brink of starvation. The time for conversations, preparation, all that is gone.
Yeah. What about the rest of the world? What about, developing countries, particularly in the African continent, the Middle East, that were already having difficulties? Now we're seeing these, food prices, scarcity, food prices going through the roof. We know that hungry people start revolutions. We saw that with the Arab Spring. Is there a risk that this will spark further conflict across the globe?
I would say, as we say, food riots are usually not about food. It is about a deep sense of injustice. It is a sense of dissatisfaction with how the governance system is running. So those risks definitely run very, very high. Food and hunger is not about food production only. Drought is natural. Famine and starvation is not natural. It is driven by political motivations. It may often be driven by conflict. So it is all very, very interconnected. The war which is happening in Russia and Ukraine is affecting the rest of the world much, much more strongly. So we were already battling or trying to address a humanitarian crisis of 811 million people going hungry. And then we face a crisis which affects the food supplies. For example, we all have heard about the humanitarian crisis in Syria. What is happening now? Syria imports 1.5 million metric tons of wheat from Russia every year. Where does it come through? From the Black Sea. So A, if Russia is on war, and B, if the Black Sea becomes a military zone.
We'll have to wrap it up soon. We're almost out of time. In fact, we will wrap it up there. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but really great to have your insights. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And that's the program. Thank you for your company. I'm David Lipson. Goodbye for now.